mics up there already. Yeah.
Hey, how you doing?
There's other law. Separately, you will do it. My kid's gonna get sick.
So not necessarily good science question.
The good science question is good future. Yeah, I always wonder if people look at that. Then you can get it. Yeah, because I get that.
Good afternoon and welcome to the first edition of WARF Essential Topics for the spring semester. My name is Laura Heisler and I'm Director of Programming for the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation. And we are delighted that you're here with us, whether you're in the room or on the Zoom. I'd like to start by just acknowledging the land that UW-Madison and the Discovery Building is on, and the land that many of you may be near or on. UW-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Tejope since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state governments repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison and WARF respect the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. Before I tell you too much about how this afternoon is going to go, I do want to make you aware of some upcoming sessions in both this series and our sister series, Entrepreneurons. On February 24th, we'll be partnering with the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies to talk about sustainability in business at 4 o'clock. And that same day at 5:30 in this room, they'll be bringing the Nelson Institute Sustainable Business Lecture here as well. So if you're interested in that, and if you got an email to today's session, we'll certainly send you an email to make you aware of that session and you can sign up. We'll also be offering this online. And I should mention all of our programs in these two series are going to be offered in person and over Zoom. And then on April 18th, we have a session on, I have to remember, on partnering with the Department of Defense and other national security agencies through our WARF Essential Topics series, and how and why you might want to consider doing that with some campus experts who have that experience, as well as some leaders who are learning more about it. And then on April 27th, we'll be partnering with the Bolt Center for Arts Administration to talk to be featuring the Arts Business Competition. So please mark these dates and consider joining us for these sessions. And we'll keep you aware of other sessions as they develop as well. In terms of how things are going to go today, we'll be hearing from our panel of experts and having a bit of a facilitated discussion amongst them. And then we'll be opening everything up for audience question and answer, as we always do at Essential Topics. If you're in the room, we're going to invite you to come up to the central microphone here in the middle so that we don't have to pass around the mic, and keep things kind of nice and clean and sanitary. So you can stand in line, and we'll make sure we get your question. If you're online, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. I will speak for you. I'll read out your question, and we'll get to as many as we can. So please bear with us and feel free to ask your questions at any time, and we'll get to them in the last 20 to 15 minutes or so of the session. So with that, I'm delighted to introduce today's moderator, my colleague from WARF, Beth Werner, who is Senior Director of Intellectual Property for the Life Sciences, who will be guiding today's discussion. So Beth, come on up.
Thanks, Laura, and thanks everyone for joining us. I'm going to invite the panelists for today to come up while I'm giving the background, just a little bit of information as to why we're here today and the topic we're going to talk about. So as Laura mentioned, I work for the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation. And for those of you in the audience who don't know what WARF is, we are a nonprofit organization established in 1925 that basically set up to move research innovations from the bench to the marketplace. And we ultimately have the goal of supporting research at UW-Madison by doing this process. How that works is that we find commercial partners which will help us to, they do the product development to commercialize the scientific research, the innovations. They share revenue with us. We then give an annual gift to the university that will support the research on campus. For those of you who may be a little bit more familiar with WARF, you might be thinking, oh, it's that organization that patents science on campus and does the whole licensing thing. And they give that big thing of money to the university once a year. And both of those are true. We do a lot of patenting inventions that arise out of the scientific research on campus. But it's not the only thing we do. And that's really why we're here. We want to talk to you today about opportunities around licensing materials. And when we talk about materials, materials may actually be something patent eligible. It may be eligible for patenting, but patent eligibility is really tied to strict criteria set up through patent law. And in many instances, materials just aren't going to meet the requirements set up. So they may not be patent eligible, as well as the fact that patents are really expensive. So it typically runs WARF about $30,000 to secure an issued US patent. The materials we see have value. They have commercial value. They have value to researchers. There's value to promote science as well. But maybe the value from a pure license revenue standpoint doesn't quite warrant that protection. And on top of that, you have to enforce patents, which escalates the potential costs around intellectual property. So these are some of the things we consider when we look at a material that's disclosed to us at WARF. And that leads me into this next question of, well, you've developed a really interesting scientific material that's in your freezer. How do you work with WARF? Interestingly, our process for disclosing and considering materials, it's the same as for patentable inventions. So we have on our website an innovation disclosure report form, an IDR. That's used for materials or patentable inventions. And you should feel free to fill that out and submit it to WARF. Super simple form. It should take you maybe 10 minutes to fill out. We'll meet with you and discuss your scientific research, discuss the potential around the materials you've got in your freezer. We'll talk about the pros and cons to patenting those, if it makes sense, if it's possible, who the commercial partners are, what you've done with the material, those sorts of details. Have you published on it? Did you put it in a paper already? Did you present a poster around those materials? All impacts what we can do and what our options and opportunities are around those materials. Ultimately, there's a committee at WARF that meets once a month to review all the innovations disclosed to us. So it's materials, patentable inventions, copyrights, everything. We talk for hours on one Thursday morning about all the innovations, because there is so much cool science that goes on this campus. And that committee determines what we're going to accept for patenting, where we might register a copyright, or what materials we're going to accept for licensing. The creators of materials are treated very much the same as inventors of patentable inventions. The revenue split for both is the same. 20% of the licensing revenue, if WARF does have success licensing the technology, 20% goes to the creators of the material, 15% goes to the department those creators are in, and the rest is part of the annual gift that WARF gives out of its endowment. So I just want to encourage everybody, if you are doing really interesting stuff, take a look at your freezer. See if you've got some antibodies, gene edited cell lines, you're working on new animal models for disease. We would love to hear about them. We have full of scientists at WARF, and we love to talk science with you. So by all means, please reach out. You don't have to go through the formal process. Shoot me an email. Happy to meet with you at any time informally just to talk about your research as well. And with that, I'm going to have our panelists introduce themselves. I was going to say I'm going to introduce it, but they are quite capable of speaking for themselves. And so what I'm going to ask them to do is just go through who they are, what they do, and what role they play in this moving of materials from the bench, from the freezer into the marketplace. So Anita, it looks like you got the hot seat. Do you want to kick us off?
Hi, I'm Anita Bhattacharya. I'm a stem cell researcher on campus. I'm in the Department of Cell and Regenerative Biology, and I have my lab at the Waisman Center. And my research involves generating and using stem cells that we derive from individuals who have different disorders. And so we get skin or blood samples from these individuals, and then we reprogram them into stem cells that we can use as models to try and understand the cellular and molecular underpinnings of these disorders. I also direct the campus stem cell core that generates and gene edits human stem cells for researchers across campus and actually outside of campus. And over the last 10 years, I've disclosed many of the cells that we have generated through WARF, and that has facilitated their distribution from WiCell. And that has, I have done that for a couple of reasons. One is it allows the cells to be used by more people in the field. As everyone knows, generating these resources is time and money expensive. And so we want other people to not have to start from scratch. And so it's a great way to share the resources with researchers worldwide. But also I'll say it also has practical aspects, at least for us, because WiCell deals with the distribution and customers, and we don't need to. And then occasionally some of our cells are considered valuable by commercial entities. And again, because we have gone through WARF, that is taken care of as well.
Thanks, Anita. Jennifer.
Sure. So I'm Jennifer Gottwald. I'm a director of licensing at WARF. I've been at WARF about 19 years now. I also came out of a lab on campus, and I remember, being that grad student who has to send out another aliquot of the antibody when somebody reads the paper and asks what it is, and trying to get everything together to do that. At WARF, I license a lot of our technologies in our life science research tool area. So I license a lot of biomaterials, and I think it's great, much for the reasons that Anita was talking about. It's an easy way to make your materials available to the research community. And there are great companies like Jamie will talk about here in a second that are willing to do that work for you and make a little bit of a profit off it and bring some money back to the university. So I guess my goal is to try to make the process as easy for the researchers as possible, which I know isn't always super easy, but we work at trying to do most of the work for you so that you can just help, you can just supply the materials and we can get them out there.
Thanks, Jennifer. Jamie, our industry contact.
Hello, everybody. Jamie Holberg. I'm head of external innovation and licensing at MilliporeSigma. I've been with the company for about 15 years. And what I do is I primarily work with academic institutions and identifying licensing new opportunities. And 9 out of 10 licenses that I do are licenses for non-patented tangible materials. And we do some 400 licenses with institutions all over the world, including WARF, and I worked with Jennifer for many years in doing so. So yeah, it's an honor to be here and look forward to having the discussion.
Thanks, Jamie. Anne?
Hi, I'm Anne Palmenberg from the Department of Biochemistry and the Institute for Molecular Virology. And as you might imagine, we've been pretty busy over the last year or so. I work actually on positive strand RNA viruses, of which coronaviruses are one. And over the past 45 years, my job in the lab and that of my people has been to take viruses apart and put them back together again to find out how they work. And when you're doing that, you develop cDNA techniques, and you develop antibodies, or you develop cell cultures that will grow particular kinds of viruses. especially respiratory viruses that I work on. And pharmaceutical companies, rather than reinvent the wheel, would much rather come to me and learn how to do that and get my reagents than do it themselves. Moreover, as you take viruses apart, they teach you all kinds of new types of biology, how polymerases work, how internal ribosomal entry sites work, what happens in a cell, and so forth. And if you're clever at biochemistry, you can go, aha, that's a novel idea. And when you have those novel ideas, or you have the reagents you've developed in the lab to do your research, you go to WARF and you say, I think this is novel enough to either make an IDR on it, or let's patent it. And then when the pharmaceutical people come, I don't have to do any of that paperwork. WARF does it all. And they just send me a message that says, take out of your freezer 3 vials of this and send it to that address, and out it goes. So over the years, we probably average 30 to 40 packages per year minimum, all sorts of different things. Last week alone, we sent out a package for a plasmid that's been in my freezer for 25 years. And somebody read the paper and went, you know what, we could use that for what we're doing. How about you send us a sample? And the paperwork is all in place because we have all of the IP protections through WARF. It's a quite easy thing to send out to academic folks to help their research. If it's a commercial enterprise, then you go through a little bit more paperwork, and that's what WARF does for us. So basically, we create stuff, come up with ideas, WARF deals with all the paperwork, and our colleagues get the materials, and occasionally we get a profit.
Well, there, and that's the end of our talk for today. So no, it's a nice job, Ann. Thank you. That's great. Erwin.
Thanks, Beth. I'm Erwin Goldman. I'm in the Department of Horticulture, and I'm a plant breeder. I breed beets, carrots, and onions and try to develop new strains that can be used by farmers in Wisconsin and really throughout the world, but also by consumers who might want to eat them. And I have to say that as being part of a land-grant university, I'm one of maybe 12 or 15 or so plant breeders who work here developing new strains of crops. This is typical in every single state in the country to have people doing this work. And up until the 1990s, we bred these things and gave all the seeds away. And it wasn't until the mid-90s we began a relationship with WARF to more formalize the way we distribute the seeds that we develop. And it's been an enormous positive contribution to our work. I would say that starting after World War II, and probably more specifically in the 1970s, the global seed industry really started to rise. And faculty are just probably not well equipped to work very directly with the transfer of biomaterials with that global seed industry. WARF has turned out to be a fabulous partner. Thank you.
Thanks, Erwin. So I wanted to throw a couple of questions to the panelists just to get the conversation going. And I think one is going to be geared initially towards the faculty members on the panel, because I know I'm off on campus and I'm talking a lot to researchers. And one of the questions I always get is, how do I know when to talk to WARF? How do I know when to approach them? And I will just make one quick caveat. Don't ever feel like you're bothering us. That I think is, I get some feedback once in a while where they're like, I didn't want to bother you guys. I don't think I've got anything of value here, so I didn't want to. Please don't feel that way. I love to learn about science on this campus. I'm a science geek, so you certainly are not going to be bothering me by contacting me to have me talk about science. That's way better, no offense to the lawyers in the audience, than talking to lawyers. So I'd much rather talk to the scientists. But what did you, as faculty members, I mean, you guys have worked with WARF for a long time, so now you've got it sort of, there's a process in place in your head. But remember back, way back when you were first going to approach WARF, what was it that triggered the, I should talk to WARF about this? Ann, you want to start us?
Well, my first approach of WARF actually was probably the most lucrative. And this is back 40 years ago, and we had a piece of a virus that did remarkable things in cell culture. And I was working with both Novogene and Promega at that time, who were developing in vitro systems for mRNA translation. They basically were developing retic extracts, and they needed markers that they could sell in their kits. And I had a viral RNA that we had converted to cDNA, and then we could manipulate it in a lab, that from a single RNA would make 5 different proteins. And we thought this was really cool because it had a protease in the middle, and this was great. So neither Promega or Novogene would license this from us unless they had intellectual property coverage. So we went to WARF and we said, we have this funky little piece of RNA here. These guys want to license it. Isn't there some paperwork that has to be done? And they went, yeah. And went through the stuff. And it was sufficiently novel that we actually patented it. And it went on the market with both Novogene and with Promega under the name of cap-independent translation enhancer, because it would make lots and lots of protein from this little piece of RNA. And it turned out that nobody cared about gel markers. What they cared about was embedded within this was the first viral iris. And we had been studying that under a different name, but there it was. So we went to them to, because we needed a license for gel markers for Novogene, and instead it ended up patenting the first viral iris. So WARF didn't have a lot of biology people at that time. So they started hiring them and to be able to understand what was going on, and since have tooled up. And you come in there now with your biology information, and they have people who can deal with it almost immediately. In fact, one of my previous postdocs is now a patent lawyer and writes my patents for WARF and many of yours as well. So they hire people who understand what's going on, can see things you didn't see in those constructs. And if there is a potential there, they get the paperwork done. So it was they weren't tooled up at that time, but it turned out to be very beneficial all the way around.
Well, as one of those biology related people who got hired by WARF, thank you, Ann. That's,
Yes.
yeah, it's great. No, and I'll just jump in real quick just to point out, I think when I started out with my background, I might have implied that it's materials or patent. That's not always the case. I think I mentioned in sort of an offhand comment, materials, I mean, there may be a reason for us to patent a material. There may be enough value there. It may meet that criteria. And so it could be a patent and material. So we secure the intellectual property rights around the patent, but then we also have the materials that a licensee would license access to the patent and then also get access to the materials we have as well. So there may be that transfer of the materials as part of the license. So I think that just wanted to clarify that point from earlier. Erwin, you got any stories of when you remember back to when
I
you
do
first came?
remember I remember it was a senior colleague of mine who I was talking to him about what I was doing. And he said, you know, you really need to go and talk to WARF. And there was not a culture of talking to WARF in my area of agriculture. It was not, we were not as connected as the basic sciences were. And I'm very grateful to that colleague. And I've noticed, I've been here 30 years, I've noticed that conversation is happening now right away when we hire people. And so I feel like in many ways, WARF has that conversation of asking WARF questions or learning what, you know, when should I disclose something or when should I fill out the IDR that you mentioned earlier? We're having that conversation with our new faculty in the first year. So I think going back to my time, I think it was a culture, there was a bit of cultural change that had to happen.
It's great. Anita, do you remember back then?
Well, now that I've been working with WARF for a while, I know the mantra of it's never too early. So I have learned something. But I will say for me, it was similar to what Erwin said. It's often colleagues. So I would go to meetings and people would be interested in the cells that we had. And I realized it wasn't until then that I realized how unique they might be, or that other people didn't want to start from scratch and make the same resources. And so that's what really gave me the impetus to talk to WARF about that and see if they would be of interest to other people and potentially commercial entities.
That's great. Thanks, Anita. I'm going to put Jamie on the spot now. So kind of a similar follow-up. I mean, what are you looking for in industry to give maybe some researchers in the audience a better idea of what you're looking for?
A lot of things, but some of the faculty already mentioned it. And the first is requests. You know, they go to scientific conferences and people ask them for it, or people send them an email and ask them for some of the material. So that's one of the things in our checklist that we're looking for when we consider licensing something is, has it been published and has it been requested? So it depends upon the type of biomaterial that we're licensing. But in general, again, we're looking for whether it's been published, where it's been published, what sort of applications it might work in. Like a simplified example would be like an antibody, a monoclonal antibody or a polyclonal antibody, what type of applications it works in. where it's been published, what the competition looks like in terms of what our competitors are selling or not. And then, of course, lastly, the requests. When I get contacted by a licensing office, they say, hey, I got a new tangible material that we might want to license you. We're getting a lot of requests. That's almost an automatic for us because that just, already tells us that there's a market for it. We don't have to necessarily do a lot of marketing for the materials. And it just goes back to the requests and it goes back to the publication that's associated with it. Because when we market the material, we could put on our website publication or publications associated with that material. And again, that's to provide example of a monoclonal antibody that might have a unique clone ID associated with it. So we can put the name of the antibody, the clone ID, and all the publications associated with it. But again, when someone contacts me and says lots of requests, that's music to my ears. So we love that.
Sort of to follow up with Jennifer, because you kind of sit in the middle of industry and the faculty. So based on the feedback that we're just hearing, I mean, when we're talking WARF intake process, Jennifer, I mean, what are some of the things you're thinking about when you're talking with researchers or asking questions about these sorts of materials?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. So Jamie is always a good reminder. Like he said, we've been working together for years and his company really does like to know, have things been requested? And I think that's a great selling point when we're talking to researchers too. If people are asking for this, we can get you it down to one dry ice shipment to a company. And then from then on, when people request the material, you can refer them to this company and they can purchase it there. So you don't have to be sending it out of your freezer all the time. That can be a huge time saver, and it also make things more widely distributed. Get it to places that maybe you people don't think of asking you, but they'll see it in a catalog and then order it. We always want to know, like, what kind of area are you working in? Are you the only person working in this particular biological area, or is this more widely applicable? Most things are more widely applicable. And why did you make this reagent? What was missing in your research that you had to make this? And what question did it allow you to answer? And what other questions are going to be out there where other people are going to want to be able to reproduce that or answer it themselves? So obviously, like something like a gene edited cell line or an antibody, you might have developed it for a particular experiment and answered a question, but it's going to open up a whole new area of other questions people can ask and other assays that can be run, some over and over again, in which case we have something that might even be more valuable to a company we want to license it to.
Yeah, Jamie?
Yeah, to follow up on what Jennifer was saying, just by virtue of the fact that someone, a researcher, an academic has made a material and they're getting requests for it, tells you something about what the current commercial offerings are. They must be limited. Otherwise, it wouldn't necessarily go to a particular researcher and ask them to spend the time to send it out. So that is, again, is just by default, and their motivation behind doing it usually says that what's out there commercially isn't good enough, or they don't have what they want.
That's great. Thanks. So the one word that keeps popping up are publications and publishing. And Jennifer, I'll put you on the spot. Otherwise, I can take the question. Do you talk to WARF before publishing, after publishing? What's the correct answer there?
So ideally, we do like to talk to people before publishing, because if there is a chance of patentability, our patent rights in most of the world, not the US, but most of the rest of the world, are going to go away once there is a public disclosure, such as a publication, a poster at a conference, talking at an open forum like this, something along those lines. So we'd love to hear about you before you publish. And oftentimes it's when you're getting that manuscript together, that's a good time to come to WARF, because you're kind of summing up what you've done to that point, thinking about next steps with that research. So that's a really good time. Like Beth said, never too early. I'd also say for biomaterials, let's say never too late. Jamie and I were just talking before this about, he came to us with a request maybe 4 or 5 years ago about a cell line from somebody who's long been retired from this university. The cell line was available with one of the postdocs who had gone on to their own career. And we were able to, you know, find the provenance of that cell line enough as to who owned it and get it licensed. And they are selling this cell line. So cell lines and biomaterials, antibodies and such, while we'd love to hear about them before the publication so we can figure out if it could be patentable or not, and if that is a worthwhile investment, we're more than happy to hear about them 30 years after that date. Anne also talked about sending out a plasmid that was however many years old. Plasmids are a little bit tricky right now to license as biomaterials because I think there's been more of a distribution that's been funded through AdGene and such, which is fine, but we'd still love to hear about them. But other things, it's never too late to come to us. And as Anne so nicely said, we can take care of the paperwork. That's what we're trained and paid to do. We just want to find out a few details from you. There are usually some questions from the company, you know, how is it available, a cell line, what passage number do you have, et cetera. Can you supply us with X amount of this? We check in with the researcher, make sure that's okay, do all the paperwork, and then make sure that once the company has contacted us, entered into the license agreement, paid some of the fees that are going to be due, then we'll ask the researcher to send out the materials to the company. And hopefully there may be a couple questions for the researcher at first about, you know, how did you grow it up? Or we're seeing this, do you have a protocol? But generally, once the company gets the materials in their hands and learns how to work with it, they're off and running and they keep the supply going and make that's their business. And we're happy to help support their business for coming back to the university.
So that is a good lead in for one of my questions to the faculty members. Is there anything about the process? I have to admit, I mean, I'm intellectual property, so I'm much more on the intake side, not necessarily the execute it, get stuff out to a commercial entity. Is that a difficult process for you as faculty members? I mean, were there things about the process that maybe didn't work as well as you would have hoped or appreciated or thought that they might, or things that we could do better or ask more questions to our industry partners? I mean, Erwin, yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. You know, in our case, the WARF is licensing material to, let's say, a company who's going to test it around the world. And the relationship might have developed between WARF and that company such that the company reports back to WARF how it's going. But sometimes I'm really curious to how it's going because in my work, I really like to know, how does this thing grow in Australia, or how does it perform? So closing that loop, I think, that's an important, and it's hard to do sometimes. You know, you think, how hard could that be? But honestly, the conversation doesn't always flow back.
No, I think that's great feedback, Erwin. And I know we have those discussions, especially in the plant space, because I think it's fascinating to me to see what kind of flavors of agreements can be put in place. So on my little glossary of terms here, we've got material transfer agreements, which many times those are used to transfer the material to someone who's going to do non-commercial research. So an academic collaborator or partner, or someone who requests it after they've read your publication. Then there's the full-on license. That's a commercial entity you discuss what the terms are, how much are they going to pay, or ultimately that's going to go back to the university. What are our expectations for the licensee? When are they going to be able to launch a product? Those sorts of things. But there is a flavor in the plant world around a trialing agreement, is what it's called, where basically it's like a research license. So it's sort of, I almost think of it in my head as a hybrid material transfer agreement and a license. I mean, the company is going to do some things with it to test it. We try to have some discussions around data and data sharing, as you might imagine, especially in today's world with data being what data is. Those conversations can be challenging. There are usually ways to compromise, I'd say, Erwin, but I do think it's a conversation we should probably have more often and in more detail.
Yeah,
commercial
thank
entities.
you.
Yeah. Anita?
So I think the process is quite easy, at least in my case, for cell lines. I would say, because the questions are very specific and they're fairly easy to answer. I would say that the hardest part for me has been the question of, when did you first think about this? And I think for many academic researchers, that can be difficult because you may have thought that you needed something long before you actually decided to make it. And so I think identifying when did you first have this idea is really the only hard part.
Okay.
for
No,
me.
that's, and I do get a lot of questions. If we talk about the form and what I get a lot of questions around, it's that one. Well, what do you mean? When did I first think about it? I've been thinking about it for 30 years. Do you need an actual date? I mean, it's going to be tough for me to think 30 years back as to when I really specifically thought about it. And then the other one is around inventorship and who invented it and who contributed and how much contributions. Those are the questions. I usually get a lot of questions around those. Anne, anything to add?
I used to have that problem of when was it invented, and then just got in the habit of writing the IDRs when I was doing it. And, or because you go to a meeting and you start talking about, I made X and we're using it for Y. And people come up to you at the meeting and start saying, I want that thing. Oh, I could use it in my system. And they're academic researchers, and you don't want to inhibit them from taking your discovery and dealing with it academically. So it is just easier to get the friggin' IDR in place, and then you're covered, because WARF will decide, is there something novel enough here that it's worth pursuing a patent? Or now that we have the IDR, are we just going to have people who want it sign an MTA, which sort of covers you until you do the patent, if you're going to, or it allows the materials to get out of your freezer and into theirs so that academics can start doing it. So I find it just easy to sit down and write up an IDR, drop it on WARF, and maybe it'll hit for a patent, maybe it won't. Materials like cell lines or antibodies, we know now that those really aren't going to ever be patented, but they're certainly going to be licensed. So as you make them in the lab and you characterize them, you take the pretty gels your students give you, write the IDR and file it, and it's off your desk. So the when you did it is like 2 weeks ago, because now it's gone. It's off my desk.
Yeah.
And
No,
your
it's-
students also ought to have pretty good research records. I mean, let us hope that is the case.
Yes. No, I think that's, it's an interesting, I mean, it's an interesting process. And I will say it sort of feeds into what Anita had said earlier of the messages you can't talk to us too early. And that's true. I mean, we do have to have some data in order to secure a patent in biological sciences and chemical sciences. But even if you're just at the idea stage or you've just done some preliminary work, I mean, maybe we don't have enough data to file a patent on it, but there may be a patent coming. We'll open a file and we'll keep it alive in our system without actively filing a patent on it, just to let you continue to play with it. It's a nice way for you to get your marker into us. So we've got an official record of it, and it keeps it in our system so we know to keep talking to you about the research, because it's a huge campus. So anything we can do to pull research out and just get it in a way that we can monitor the progress that you guys are making and hopefully make the process a little bit easier. Jamie, kind of in a similar vein, what are your expectations working with faculty members or academic researchers when you license in a technology? Do you actively talk to them, or is it more case by case?
It's case by case. Ordinarily, if whatever we want to license, we prefer always have a conversation with the researcher and vendor about the type of technology that they might want to license. And we mostly are looking for technical information, how it works, what conditions it works on, any special requirements, et cetera. And each university, each institution is different in how we work with the faculty. And, just to compliment WARF and how great they are to work with, there's some institutions where I just go directly to the researcher, because I know if I contact the licensing office, might not always get a response. I know, having worked with Jennifer for so long, that if I contact her, I know that she's going to eventually get in contact with the researcher to see whether or not it's available for licensing, or to facilitate that call to learn more about the particular technology that we might want to license. So here working with WARF has been great. So it's almost an automatic. Just go directly to Jennifer and she facilitates that, which is great because, like I said, at other institutions, it's not always the case. So I might have to go directly to the researcher, and then got to go work around sort of a different direction.
Sure. Well, that's great. Well, I'm thinking we'll open it up to questions and answers in just a couple minutes. I'm going to give the panel one last shot. If there are any final thoughts they have, or anything they want to, I'm kind of putting them on the spot here, anything they want to just convey to the audience, by all means. I mean, it's Jamie. Or no?
Yeah, sure. So, To put it in perspective for you, at least from the business that I support at MilliporeSigma, whether or not, what's the value of a patent or not, to us. And, I get this question a lot, and maybe the best way I can sort of explain it is that, let's say you develop a very unique reagent or tangible material, and I'll use the example of, like, say, a hybridoma to make a monoclonal antibody, right? And it's very unique. It's kind of one of a kind type of material. And let's say that you go through the process of filing a patent on it, and you go through the whole process. Let's say you do get an issued patent for this hybridoma cell line, but that unfortunate circumstance happens where your freezer breaks down, or our freezer breaks down, okay? And the hybridoma is gone, but you have a patent. Well, for us, what value is that to us? It's nice to have the patent, but we don't have the hybridoma to make the antibody. So that should tell you from our perspective and my perspective in particular about, how important it is to have a patent on something as valuable as, the golden rabbit or the golden mouse to make that antibody. So hopefully that puts it in perspective for you from ours, the value of a patent for a lot of the tangible materials that we offer.
Yeah, Jennifer.
So a couple of points. One, I wanted to point out that I've been talking about how I will license biomaterials to a company like MilliporeSigma that's going to put them in a catalog and make them available to researchers both in industry and in academia. I also want to mention that sometimes, and Anne kind of touched on this, we have biomaterials that maybe are not quite as exciting where a company wants to put them in a catalog to make them widely available, but they're super exciting to a biotech company or a pharma company working on some sort of human healthcare application. And in that case, I can license those into that company for internal research. So they're not going to make a product out of those materials. They're not going to transfer them further, but they want those materials in-house so that their researchers can work on them to replicate some of the same experiments you've done and move it further in their development of a vaccine or of a therapeutic or something along those lines. And those are really good licenses to have as well. They won't carry a royalty rate, but will generally charge the company some amount a year that they keep using those materials in-house. And sometimes it can be a way to forge a connection with that company where your research interests are aligned, and there may be some sort of collaboration between you and that company, which is one way to see your research kind of go out and get more applied within the world. So I wanted to bring that up. And then I also wanted to say, particularly for more of the reagent companies like MilliporeSigma, I've been working, and it's been great that Jamie's been stable and I've been stable for however many years now. We can do a license really quickly. We know each other well. We have licenses we've done, within the past year or so. We can dust it off, change a couple of the words in there, and not have to go through a lot of the back and forth and the legal negotiations that a license with a company will normally take. So we're trying to make this more turnkey for our industrial partners as well, to get these materials out there and used within the world. So that's something we're really working at as well.
That's great. Thanks, Jennifer. Erwin, yeah.
One unexpected benefit for me of working with WARF was the level of professionalism with which my work is represented to the industry. And I'm happy to represent myself at academic conferences or in the classroom with students. But when it comes to working with business people at companies, I just felt like the WARF folks made that relationship so much more professional and frankly, more informed. And so that was something that I didn't realize that I could have from WARF, and it's made a big difference.
Well, that's great, Erwin. Thanks. I appreciate that. It is something, it's been interesting to me to see faculty members in industry when those meetings do happen, some of the questions. And I think sometimes we kind of think of I mean, no offense, Jamie, industry, profit, 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 science, and they're not so worried about the science, but really there are good scientists, great scientists in industry, and they're working on interesting problems, and it may align with your scientific research. I mean, having those conversations, and it's nice when you've got that material as sort of the entryway and the way to open a door to a potential industry partnership, as Jennifer said. I think some of those early conversations can lead to something a little bit deeper in a relationship. Anne or Anita, anything? Anne?
Just to, well, let's see. We're all responsible scientists. And when we write our research grants, we always put the phrase in there about how, if we did this, we're going to cure cancer and save the world. And we put that in there because NIH likes that kind of thing. But in truth, what we do in the laboratory doing our particular research really needs to be translated into the greater whole. And we don't do that ourselves. If you're a researcher in biochemistry, you're not doing clinical stuff. But if you are aware of what WARF can do for you, they'll do the translation for you. You make something that you are using and has a practical value to your research. You go to WARF and you say, hey, there may be other folks out there who would be interested in this stuff because I'm getting requests back from my paper or whatever it happens to be. And you can sit in your laboratory and keep doing your fundamental research, but they are distributing this stuff out there into the great beyond. And so fundamentally, by having WARF do that and facilitate all of the IP paperwork and facilitate the licensing and just getting the stuff out of your freezers and into other people's hands, it fundamentally is translational and it's transformative too. So that what you do in your lab gets out to the greatest good and other groups. So I've been very happy with having WARF do that for me, so I don't have to. I can work in the lab, but you need to have an awareness of, gee, I made this. It's not just good in my freezer, but the guy down the hall or the guy across the street or the guy at the next university might want to use this too. And if you have that simple awareness, you take that idea to WARF, they do the paperwork, and then the stuff starts moving around in the great beyond. It's how research really gets out there physically, in addition to what you publish in your papers.
That's great.
It's
Thanks,
easy.
Anne.
It's easy to do.
That is, we do try. I'll just chime in here as well. It's one of the things that we at WARF, we take pride in this idea that we're trying to be a value add. I mean, we know that you have your priorities, and your priorities are to do the scientific research that you're doing and to run the labs you're running and to do the education of your students. And we know that technology transfer, patenting, licensing, pretty far down that priority list. And we get it. I mean, we get it. And we need you to keep your priorities the way they are. Please keep doing the great science. That's the value add we feel we bring to it, is we can make things as easy as we can possibly make them for you, because we don't want any barriers to you talking to us and getting involved in this process. We're all scientists. We love the science piece of it. We work with great attorneys, and our licensing staff has great contacts at companies as well. So that's hopefully our value add. Any final thoughts, Anita, that you wanted to bring up, or?
Maybe just that from this discussion, it sounds like many of us heard about disclosing our reagents or our biologicals to WARF through colleagues. And I think that that is something that I think we continue to do. I know I tell a lot of colleagues that they should do this. And I think that if a colleague tells you about it, it's usually because they had a good experience. So.
No, it's great. It is one thing that we do try to do a lot of outreach on campus. We try to participate in a lot of talks like this that are themed. We'll give talks at classes. I know I've taught in Irwin's class. We had quite the streak there going on annually, talking about plant intellectual property and how you go about protecting plant varieties and commercializing those. So we try to get out on campus a lot, but I'm with you, Anita. It's amazing to me how many times when I ask, well, how did you hear about WARF, or what drove you to disclose? I was talking to a colleague. I mean, Erwin, I think, gave the example as well. I talked to a colleague and we were talking about our research, and they said, hey, this might be something of interest to WARF. Have you talked to WARF about this? And I didn't even think about it. And I think, well, geesh, how do I get the outreach to people so that people really do know to come and talk to us? So I think that I agree. Getting the word out is just one-on-one word of mouth is a big thing.
And I'll give a shout out to Anne there. We always make a point of looking through new faculty coming in any semester in the departments and such that are likely to have IP to disclose to us. And we'll arrange a, welcome to the UW and we're WARF and here's who we are with them. And there was one within this pandemic time where we, sat down in the virtual Zoom room to talk to him and he's like, oh, Anne Palmenberg already told me about you people. So
That's great. Well, do we have a question?
We do have a question.
All right.
We have a question wondering if licensing biomaterials before publication will affect the publication in any way.
So I would say in general, you do want to probably wait until a publication is out until something is released as a product. So in most points, you can go ahead. We might not license the biomaterial till after it has been published. You can disclose to us before publication because we'll want to assess whether we should be patenting it or not. But the license might not happen until after a publication because companies like Jamie's want to be able to point to a publication and say, somebody used this and this is what you can get. That said, occasionally we do run into something that's going to be super hot and trendy, and we can be doing some of that paperwork behind the scenes before the publication comes out, making sure that the company's not offering it for sale until the publication does come out. But sometimes you want to be lined up that way too, so that it's available immediately upon publication.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we do value the publication. That's one of the main things that we look at. But if we believe that something is going to be really in high demand, or a researcher maybe already is getting requests for it, if we could time the publication when it's available on the website, that's perfect. We've had a few examples of those where it's really paid off, because otherwise, we run into this situation a lot where it's published and it's a new publication, but then we contact the licensing office afterwards. We do in-license it and get it ready for commercialization. But in the meantime, the researcher's getting a lot of requests, right? And so we got to kind of go as fast as we can. I just was talking to Jennifer earlier about an example of a license that we did together where it's going to be available the next month or so. We already got customers waiting to buy it. So, nothing's perfect, but we do want to know about things before they're published as well. But just the hopes that they will be published at some point in time.
So a follow-up question for you, Jamie. I mean, just a ballpark, how long would it take a company like your company, when you know of a technology, to get it into the catalog and get it ready for sale?
Well, just during the pandemic, because we had some reagents that were related to COVID, lightning speed for us is 3 months.
Okay.
That's lightning speed. I mean, that's like pulling everything together. But, other than that, it's anywhere between 6 and 12 months.
Okay.
I would say more like, 8 months.
So again, with that publication, I mean, we do have some time before it's going to be out there
Yep.
that publication can happen.
Yep.
Question, yeah.
Yeah, since we're talking about timing, I was curious about, in the training environment, it can be really hard for a student to hold off on publication or postdoc, or you need to submit that key data for a grant application. It's really hard to wait, 2-3 years to see if it's patentable. How do you suggest that investigators handle that situation?
You want to take it, Jennifer? You want me to take it?
Why don't you jump in?
All right, I
first,
can do
Beth?
that. So the quick short answer is WARF isn't going to tell you not to publish. All right. It is perhaps one of the most challenging aspects of my job, is seeing technology come through the door that may be a little too early to patent, but it's going to get published. We have to make that decision internally, is what is the chance of, with the data set we have, what are the chances of us getting a defensible patent out? In some instances, we can file what's called a provisional patent application that buys us an additional year to allow additional work to be done to strengthen the patent. All right. In some instances, there's really not even enough data, and we don't really know what the invention is yet even. I mean, there's so many unknowns and so many details that we may elect to have you publish. We may say, you know what, go ahead and publicly disclose that, go to that meeting, present it, and let us know what feedback you get, because that while Jennifer made the point earlier, we've lost rights in a lot of the rest of the world. That's not a deal breaker for us. I mean, we still focus a lot on the US market, and we still have a year from when it's publicly disclosed to file. So you presenting it or publishing on it can be interesting market information for us, where maybe we're hemming and hawing, was there really going to be commercial interest or not to justify the patent, and all of a sudden you get 12 requests. Well, it seems likely then that a patent in this instance may be warranted. So that's useful for us. What I will say is just please let us know. I think you can't talk to us too early. You can certainly talk to us too late. And I have instances in my 17 years at WARF where a researcher comes to me 2 weeks after the 1-year date of the publication, not realizing that it was published online earlier than it was in print. And then I look at it and say, we've missed our 1-year bar date and there is no patent to be had here. Maybe there's still some value from a material standpoint, but we've lost our patent rights. That is scarier to me than having to patent a little early. WARF gives us a lot of latitude to be aggressive in filing where it makes sense, and we can move fast. And I don't say that to encourage people to come to me a day before a meeting so that I got to have a patent attorney file something in a day, because that's unpleasant for everybody, but we could do it. If I've had researchers getting on the plane, they're heading off, they forgot to talk to us, we have to move quickly. We can do that. We just need to know what your publication strategy is, when those deadlines are, and then it's on us to make sure that something gets filed before it publishes, or we focus on the US rights and just go there.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So I have a similar, sort of another question for, we don't have any other questions online, Laura?
Not yet.
I will encourage people watching along online, send those questions in, whatever you guys are interested in. These are some great experts. So you've got the availability of some great experts to get your questions answered. One question I had, I guess it's primarily for the faculty members, is sort of in line with this idea that students need to publish. And I think, again, some of the feedback I sometimes get is that the patent process is just a way to slow everything down and students don't get much value out of it. And I don't lead you down that path to say, oh yeah, I want you all to say, yeah, yay, patents are great for my students. I'm just curious, do you think there's benefits or problems with the WARF processes or the patent idea around students or education, or what are your thoughts around that? Yeah.
So I guess I work in a space where patenting is not likely. It's, biological reagents, but I still think that is useful, and it's maybe easier than in some ways for students. But I think, again, we try and think about disclosing to WARF fairly early in the process. So as soon as we make a cell line, when, for graduate students, it's going to take a couple of years before they're actually able to do something with it. So I do think that people think a lot about the patenting part, but I think there's also a really large area of just licensing and materials, biological materials.
Anybody else want to comment if it's useful for students or not, more detrimental? Yeah, Erwin?
I think it's very useful. Many of our students are going to work for global multinational companies that have patent portfolios. In fact, in a recent graduate, the first assignment that graduate had at the company was to figure out whether the company should be licensing several patents that were out there. So students increasingly are asking for that kind of experience. That said, if it's with their own work, I could understand there could be some complications with the trajectory. Nevertheless, I think the space is such an educationally rich space for our students. So I see value there.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I'd say that patents and IDRs look great on a CV. And anyone going into biotech or wants to ever go into biotech, that's great stuff. And I've never had it be a problem with publication at any level, because when a student has done something that looks like it might be useful and we want to bounce it off of WARF, you sit with them and you write that first draft of the paper, and and I know that first draft isn't the one that's going in, but you take that first draft and you take it out to WARF along with the figures that go with it, and you say, here's the crude thing we're working on. And they put it in front of one of their patent people, or Jennifer or whoever, and who understands the work. And there's some, especially for virology, there's some excellent people out there. And where they sit and discuss it, and actually that discussion can help actually focus the paper, number one. And, well, wait a minute, we still have this question remaining. Oh, yeah, that'd be good. We'll put that in there too. And by the time you get to the second draft of the paper, they've already got a patent drafted, if in fact you're going to go in that direction. So I've never found that to be rate limiting. And that is also true for posters or seminars and things like that. It just hasn't been a problem. Maybe with some of the really lucrative cell lines that you don't want to disclose ahead of time, but the first draft of the paper is all you need to take out to WARF. It has not been a problem with any of my students, and they love to have that on their CV, both IDRs and if it ends up being a patent.
Thanks, Anne. Question from online.
We do. We have a question from Michael Falk, who commends the panel on a really experienced panel, a group of experts. He would be interested to hear reflections on how campus attitudes toward patenting have changed. Are students and researchers today more open and interested in patenting? Have they seen resistance in supporting commercialization among their colleagues?
Erwin?
I can make a comment on that, Laura, and thank you to Michael for that great question. Recently, I worked with a group of people in economics. We wrote a paper on this subject, and I don't claim to be an expert, but I contributed a little bit to it. I think there is still, in my area and in many parts of my fields connected to me, there's still a lot of, I would say, resistance to patenting, and also a sense that we should be figuring out different ways to get our materials out into the world without intellectual property protection. I don't know how true that is across all of the basic sciences, but in the applied sciences, that does seem to be present there. Now, I will say that while there are many faculty who feel that way, there are many students, many incoming students who do not. And so I don't think it's a monolith. I think it varies. And I see many students who really see that their future is with the industry and with these companies that are doing that work. So there's a bit of both, I think.
It's interesting. Anybody else want to speak to that?
So I will say that at least in the basic biological sciences, that there is more of an openness, I think. And I can't really speak much to patenting, but there is certainly more collaboration between industry and labs, which I think creates a much more open environment, so you can actually have more of those discussions.
Yeah, Jennifer.
Can I put a quick shout out to something else I work on within WARF, but not directly in licensing, and that is that patenting, all the studies that have been going on the past few years have found that groups that are underrepresented in science in general, women, different racial and ethnic minorities, they're also underrepresented in patenting. And I think patenting can be a really powerful way to stake your claim, to get your technology, to get your research in a way that can be applied in the real world. And I think we have groups that aren't accessing it at the rates that they should be based on the amazing research that they're doing. So you can also think of a patent as more of a something that gives you acknowledgement and potential application and power, and not everybody's accessing that. So we'd love to see more of that as well.
I think that's a great
It's
point.
really cool to see your stuff in a catalog.
Yeah. It's really cool when I see your stuff in a catalog too, and I gotta tell
Well.
you, I love it. I love it. So, well, I think we're about at time here. I don't know if anybody else here in the audience had any quick question, if we wanted to throw it to the panelists. If not, I'm going to thank you all for this. It was great. I had no doubts it would be. So I appreciate everyone's time and an interesting conversation. And just thank the audience again for your attention, and feel free to talk to us, because we love hearing what's going on campus. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
All right. I've got 5 antibodies coming your way. We'd much